that right?
No, Dorian is recording, yeah.
Dorian, okay, perfect. Okay, recording. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning to the Fundamentals of Health research series. I'm Audrey Tierney. I'm a dietitian over in the School of Allied Health, and I'm part of the HRI Management Committee. And I'm going to facilitate this morning's research series session with Dr. Ronni Greenwood, who's going to speak to us on research ethics. Before we do, just some housekeeping. So if you can just unmute your microphone and turn your camera off during the presentation, but feel free then to turn cameras back on for the question and answer session at the end. The session is being recorded, but we will stop the recording for the question and answer session. You can ask questions throughout in the chat function, and I'll keep an eye on these. And then we can ask, we'll have time for questions at the end. The slides and the recording will be available on the HRI members SharePoint as of this Friday, close of business. And if you want the slides, the requests, you can email request to hri@ul.ie. All training and event dates are available in that HRI members SharePoint calendar, but just to point you to some upcoming members lunch sessions and other fundamental series. So on the next Thursday, February the 8th, we have a face-to-face session. So the HRI members lunch in the Cirque building, and Louise Barry and Sheila Ryan are going to talk to us about research in nursing. And then February the 9th from 1 to 2, you would have seen that email going around from Zora, who's the statistician in the HRI, who's going to do a statistics training workshop and other events there highlighted. But again, all in the HRI SharePoint folder. So moving on now to our session this morning around research ethics, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ronni Greenwood. So Ronni is a social community psychologist and senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology in the University of Limerick. And I have the pleasure of working with Ronni on the Healthy UL initiative. But Ronni's areas of interest of research expertise include the ecological aspects of psychological well-being and distress among members of marginalised social groups. If homeless service providers foster or undermine service users' personal resources, and the role of social supports in protecting members of visible immigrant groups. Ronni has served as the EHS Research Ethics Chair for quite a while, and so is very knowledgeable around research ethics. And so I'd like to welcome Ronni to share her slides and give her presentation. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Audrey. Yeah, it's I was the chair for 4 years, and so that time of my life has come to an end. So this will be handed over to the new chair of the ethics committee, and I'm not unhappy. I'm not unhappy about that. So let me see if I can let's see, present. Let's see if I can put this slideshow from beginning. Is that working for me? Yes. Okay. How does that look to you? No, you guys. How does that look to you all?
You need to go full screen.
Yeah. Here we go. How's that? Does that work?
No,
that doesn't work.
Oh, now we're seeing,
okay, hang on.
Seeing your view.
I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Stop share. Let's see here. Let me try again. Okay. This doesn't seem to give me the opportunity to share my, yeah, here, sharing Teams, presenting
top right,
Teams.
Ronni, there should be, yeah, sharing Teams.
Yeah, I'm still learning that. I think I'm coming to an age where I'm not great at technology anymore. Okay, so how does that look? What are you seeing?
Yes, yeah, we're seeing full screen. Perfect.
Okay, now let's see what happens for me. Okay, so yeah, good. So today I'm going to talk about research ethics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why we have research ethics in the first place, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some principles of research ethics, then about our procedures, the way that ethics is reviewed in the Education and Health Sciences Rec and in OLREG, the university the overarching university research ethics governance would coordinate that across our 4 faculties, so we wouldn't be unusual in that. And then answer any questions that you have. And along the way, I want to ask you some questions as well. So I was just kind of interested if we could get an idea, if people aren't feeling shy this morning, about what are the different roles of people here? Do we have any postgrads or postdocs? Or how many people do we have from UHL? I'm thinking that we might have quite a few people from UHL. I wasn't sure about the names on the list. And I wanted to know if there were any brave souls who might say what you hoped to get out of today's session. I won't, and then we can hold that in mind and see if today's talk captures that, and then come back to it in the Q&A if we don't capture it. But I am curious to know, does anybody want to say why you chose to spend your hour with me today? And is there any kind of burning question that you were hoping to get answered for today? And we'll just give that a second and see if anybody jumps in, and it's fine if nobody has anything to come back with there. Okay. Anne, did you want to say something?
Oh, did you want us to do it in the chat or just to jump in to say it?
Either way, you can pop it in the chat, or you can say it either way.
Well, I'm here because it's you, and I'm really keen to hear, I suppose, more about ethics, and especially from someone like you that's been, I suppose, involved for the last number of years. I'm a first-year PhD student in the School of Medicine, and I am working on migrant health, and especially, I suppose, the communication barriers that migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees experience accessing healthcare.
Yeah.
When they come to Ireland. So that's, I suppose, what I'm doing. And obviously I'll be working with a lot of I suppose people that could be considered vulnerable and might have access issues and things like that. So I suppose I will need to be very attentive to ethics and ensuring that I suppose everything I do is very considered and appropriate and meaningful and purposeful. So I'm just hoping to learn as much as I can.
Perfect. Yeah, great. So I think as I go along and mention the different principles, ethical principles, you'll see that they apply quite strongly to the work that you would do with migrant groups in Ireland, especially trying to access healthcare services or in any piece of research, right? Because potentially vulnerable population, potentially a population that may feel obligated to participate in research, may not exactly understand whether, how free they are to choose or not, and worry that there would be consequences for not participating in your research. Maybe have a difficulty or easily misconstrue, what they get back for participating. All of these things might be relevant to the type of research that you would do or how you would approach your research with that particular group. Lots of good examples there. Yeah. Let's see what's in the chat. Let's see, do we have any? Yvonne, registered advanced nurse practitioner. Okay, update your knowledge on ethical principles. Okay, well that puts me, okay, let's see what we can do there. Let's see. Please, everybody, if there's anything where you want to have a discussion along the way, we could do a little bit of that, and we can also just go through the slides and answer questions at the end. So it's up to you. Okay, postdoc Pez, anything about the use of AI in research? Now, I don't cover AI in research and certainly would not pretend to be any kind of expert in that emerging area, but it is interesting. So maybe we can have a quick group discussion about that at the end of this talk. That would be a good idea. It's something we're going to have to deal with it one way or the other, and better to face it head on, I think. Okay, let's see what we've got in the next slide here. So why do we have a research ethics committee in the first place, and why must your research be reviewed and approved by the research ethics committee? Why can't you just get on with your research, and what is the big deal, and why are we putting these blocks up to your research? when you're not doing anything wrong and you're not going to be hurting anybody. You're just asking a simple question and you just want to run a simple questionnaire with your participants. Why do you have to go through this hoop? I feel you and I hear you, but I've got plenty of examples of why we had to have ethics principles and policies put into place. So I'm going to give you 3 of many examples of historical injustices in research with human participants that led us to the place we are now with governance and oversight and principles and ethical principles and research integrity. So the first of these is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that began in 1932 in the United States Public Health Service. It's where the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama ran the Tuskegee syphilis study. It initially involved 600 Black men, impoverished sharecroppers living in Macon County, Alabama. There were 399 men with syphilis and 201 without syphilis at the beginning of the study. No informed consent. Misrepresented the study as if they were being treated for bad blood. They received no treatment. In exchange for participating in this study, they received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. In the mid-1940s, penicillin became the treatment of choice for syphilis, but the men themselves in this study, they were not treated so that they could watch the natural progression of syphilis and see what happened. In 1972, the study was still going on, and at that point, it finally got media attention. And due to this media exposure, the study finally ended. An investigation concluded that the study was unethically unjustified and the results were disproportionately meager compared to the known risks to the participants. Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta died of cervical cancer at the age of 31 in 1951. Henrietta's cervical cells were biopsied and they entered into biomedical research in Johns Hopkins Hospital without her consent. In what proved to be one of the most important scientific discoveries ever, for some reason, Henrietta's cervical cells are immortal. They are the first immortalized human cell line. And Henrietta didn't know this. Henrietta's family didn't know this. Henrietta's cells became the basis of most cell-based research across the globe and even into space. Through the biomedical industry, Henrietta's cell lines have returned billions of dollars in sales, and these cells are called the HeLa line after her initials, HeLa. These cells contributed to scientific breakthroughs in cancer, AIDS, radiation, gene mapping, countless other areas of research. And Henrietta and her family saw none of this revenue and none of this fame or glory. They couldn't even afford health insurance. There's this wonderful book. I have it on my shelf. You can borrow it from me, or you can watch the movie produced by Oprah Winfrey about Henrietta's life, and I highly recommend it. Third, Ted Kaczynski. Now, Henry A. Murray was the director of the psychological clinic at Harvard Psychological Clinic from 1959 to 1962, and he conducted a study there ostensibly about how people respond to stress. But these studies were actually quite psychologically and abusive and damaging to the participants. These were unwitting students, uninformed about the purpose of the study, and these students included Ted Kaczynski, who developed into a person who was called the Unabomber. They were subjected to intensive interrogation in this study that Murray himself described as vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks on their egos and their most cherished ideals and beliefs. Ted Kaczynski became the American domestic terrorist we call the Unabomber. He sent bombs through the mail to people he believed were advancing modern technology at the expense of the environment. Now, we can't prove Murray produced the Unabomber, but we also can't prove that Ted Kaczynski wouldn't have become someone else if he hadn't met Henry Murray, the famed and celebrated psychologist. Okay, so these are just 3 examples. So we obviously cannot police ourselves, and we cannot mind ourselves, and we cannot be trusted to protect people and do research in an ethical way. So one of the first responses to these kinds of egregious practices in research was from the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. It was published in 1978. It was prompted as a result in part of the revelations from the investigation of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So there are 3 basic ethical principles that were listed in the Belmont report, and these are respect for persons, beneficence, and no maleficence, and justice. So the application of respect for persons is voluntary and informed consent. Beneficence and no maleficence is an assessment of risks and benefits to participants, and justice refers to the ways in which participants are selected and excluded from research. Now, I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to present for you today and unpack the principles that my association, the American Psychological Association, developed for us to follow, the ethical principles that we are supposed to adhere to. And these are beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. So the first of these principles is principle A, beneficence and non-malfeasance. This includes do no harm. We have a duty to protect our participants. We have a duty to do research with minimal risk to participants and to minimize risk. So for an obvious example is you choose the design of minimal risk, even if it might not be the gold standard of design. So for example, you're interested in the effect of head injuries on IQ test performance. Well, we can't randomly assign people to group and give them head injuries, right? That would be the gold standard to be able to randomize people to head injury or not. But obviously that doesn't minimize risk. So what we have to do is take advantage of naturally occurring groups and compare those with head injuries to those without head injuries. And so we are supposed to avoid conflicts of interest, and this would include things like dual relationships between the researcher and the teacher. That's something that we commonly experience here in a university setting that we often, like particularly in say the medical school and in the School of Education. Our colleagues often do research, and they're researchers with their own students, and that can create a conflict of interest. Because psychologists' scientific and professional judgments and actions do affect the lives of others, we have to guard against personal, financial, social, and organizational and political factors that can lead to misuse of our influence. But don't think we always get that right, because even up to and probably beyond 2004, we have egregious examples of the American Psychological Association violating its own principles. So you might remember the public disclosure in 2004 of those photos of prisoner abuse by American military personnel at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. So according to the New York Times, the American Psychological Association secretly collaborated with the administration of President George W. Bush to bolster a legal and ethical justification for the torture of prisoners in the post-September 11 war, quote unquote, war on terror. And the APA secretly coordinated with officials from the CIA and the White House and the Department of Defense to create an APA ethics policy on national security interrogations that comported with then classified legal guidance, authorizing the CIA torture program. This is what was concluded in the report on this event or these events. And the involvement of health professionals in the Bush-era interrogation program was significant because it enabled the Justice Department to argue in secret opinions that the program was legal and did not constitute torture, since the interrogations were being monitored by health professionals to make sure they were safe. So it never really ends. We think that these kinds of actions ended with Tuskegee and the Milgram experiment and the Stanford experiment, but we have to continuously monitor and guard against them forever, apparently. Principle B is fidelity and responsibility. So fidelity and responsibility means that we are supposed to uphold the ethical standards of our discipline and take responsibility for our actions as well as other people, our colleagues' actions. We're supposed to collaborate with other professionals to serve the best interests of the individuals that we work with. And we're supposed to devote some of our time working with others without compensation. That means we should give some of our time to volunteer work. Principle C is integrity. This means that we should be accurate, honest, and truthful in our research, our teaching, and our practice. It means that we don't steal, cheat, or engage in fraud, deception, or intentional misrepresentation of fact. And it means that we balance justifications for deception in research with the negative effects of deception. So sometimes, in some ways, we have to engage in some kind of deception. If we tell our participants what our hypothesis is, it can spoil our results, for example. I think that's in any piece of research. When participants think they know what we're looking for, it can change their behavior. So we don't know if our manipulation or our medicine or our intervention caused the change, or if it was the participants' hunches about what in the world are they doing with this research anyway. I think they're looking for X, so I'm going to behave accordingly, or I'm going to challenge them. I'm going to push back, and I'm going to show them that their manipulation didn't affect me. And they may be right or wrong in terms of their inferences about our hypotheses. So we have to be careful about that. In some ways, we often in psychology deceive our participants by leaving out crucial information that we then provide to them in a debriefing. So we have to balance that. We have to balance the extent to which we leave out information with the need to provide our participants with voluntary informed consent. Principle D is justice, and principle E is respect for people's rights and dignity. So people are entitled to fairness and justice and equal benefit of psychology and psychological services. We don't operate beyond the boundaries of our competencies. We respect our patients and clients and participants' rights to dignity, confidentiality, and self-determination. And we protect vulnerable populations while we do in the course of our research and dissemination and of our research findings. And we show respect for cultural diversity and diversity that arises from personal identities, social categories, and social identities. And we cultivate and develop intercultural competencies. So I mentioned there voluntary and informed consent. I hope I've made it clear to you. I hope there's no questions around what voluntary and informed consent means or why it's important. But I wonder if, in addition to the kinds of examples I mentioned, can anybody think of circumstances from your own research or research in your discipline that makes it difficult for consent to be voluntary and or informed, and how that's managed? Does anybody have any other examples of that or questions about it? So is there anybody out there who's a teacher and a researcher? How do you manage research with your students? Or maybe you're a nurse and you're doing research with your patients. How do you manage that? Has that ever caused you a challenge? So, yeah, Audrey?
I've been a clinician and a researcher some time ago now, but yeah, like especially if you're seeing patients that like the bias there or the power element, for want of a better word, So we would just get somebody like that's not in the research team or even not really in the clinical team to consent the patient and inform them of the studies, so that if they wanted to say no, they didn't feel like it's going to affect their relationship. So same with students. If we're doing research with students, we would not consent them. We would try and get an outside either another lecturer who's not within the course, or a lecturer within the discipline but not teaching them that subject to consent, just so that there's not that element of power bias there.
Yeah. And to sample in ways so that it's impossible for you to know who was asked, so that you can't draw inferences about who chose not to participate, because that could, you can, that can make people feel obligated too. Well, she knows I was asked, and so I better participate, or else I might not get a good grade, for example. Voluntary consent becomes challenging when we're working with protected populations like children, and also prisoners, people with intellectual difficulties, to make sure that their participation is voluntary. It's particularly challenging if you go into institutional settings like prisons, to make sure that incarcerated people know that they can have the right to refuse to participate. There's all kinds of situations in which our relationship to the participant, or some kind of particular characteristic of that potential participant, makes it difficult for or makes voluntary participation particularly challenging. Setting up gatekeepers, setting up sampling procedures so that so it's clear to the participant that the researcher does not know whether they participated or not, so that they don't feel so it can minimize any sense of obligation based on dual relationships with that person. Assessments of risks and benefit. Okay, so we're supposed to minimize risks to participating in. Let's talk about health research, since this is the HRI. When you think about risks to participating, if you were to, these are different categories of where risks might arise, different situations in which risks might arise that are related to the way that we design our studies. So what about risks to participation for particular populations? Are there any populations for which risk to participation is greater, where we need to seek to minimize that risk? The thing that pops to my mind as a non-medical researcher is, research on new medicines, testing out the effects of medications or procedures. And there's always going to be some kind of risk, I assume, to participating in that in a study for people who may be ill. Maybe someone has a diagnosis of some kind of disease or illness that they want to, an experimental medication is being tried with that population, and that is a risk. Can you think of any data protection procedures that might be risky for participants? Any kinds of topics that might be, there's sensitive topics and study designs. So what we need to do in the research, that when we design our research, we need to think about and plan out to mitigate risk based on populations that our participants belong to, the kinds of procedures we use to collect data, data protection, how we're going to protect participants' data, whether we're asking, are we investigating a sensitive topic, a topic that could cause a person to feel embarrassed or negatively affect their mood or their self-esteem? Are we choosing the best study design? Is there a study design that would be more appropriate for minimizing risk for our participants? We need to consider all of these aspects of our study development and procedures. And one of the things that we're supposed to do is assess the benefits of participating for in our studies. So any ideas, like when you design a study, do you bear this in mind when you're conducting your research with your participants? What is the benefit of participating in your research? We often tack this on in an ethics proposal, right? Or we'll say, you know, your participation isn't going to benefit you directly, but it may contribute to our understanding of a particular phenomenon. Or thank you for your research, for your participation in our research. It's going to help the development of this new scholar who may be an undergraduate student or a PhD student. So that is a more of an altruistic reason for participating in our research, but it is something that we should bear in mind and something that we should not just fill in as the last box in our application form, but really consider how are they benefiting. Claire, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Ronni, hi, thank you. I was just wondering how ethics committees feel about giving something to the students or the patients for participating in a study, you know, like a voucher or, you know, a chance to win something.
You know, okay, I believe that that's quite discipline specific, that there's in essence, in other words, that there's a lot of diversity of opinions. So I know when I came, so in psychology, we often remunerate just a token of appreciation. It might be, you know, well, actually, in some places, the amount that is given can be quite high, or you might think it's quite high. When I do research with people in homeless situations, they often get a 20 € voucher. In the past, that would have been $25 cash. In New York, we would have even given $50 cash. People worry that that money will be misused, and so we give vouchers now, for one vouchers now. In some disciplines, there's absolutely no remuneration, and so when I came to UL, I had conversations with colleagues from PES who were like, you can't remunerate people for, you know, they would have people come into the lab and spend all day doing all kinds of invasive physical procedures with no remuneration. And I was shocked you don't give them anything for their time and their discomfort in response. And so it's a disciplinary, there's disciplinary variation, but the ethical concern or principle is, you know, are you giving them an offer that they can't refuse? So my favorite example from psychology is the story that is told about the Kinsey experiments, about people's sexual practices, and about how the researchers in the Kinsey Institute would go in the 1950s to American, you know, housewives' homes with their children toddling around and ask them to talk about their sexual practices sitting at the kitchen table. And they'd go to the door and go, you know, can I interview you about this? And she'd say, no way. And then they'd come back and say, can I give you $10 to talk to you about it? And she'd be like, no way. And then, you know, you get to $50 and you go, maybe you can talk to me about my sexual practices in front of my kids, right? So at what point is it becoming coercion? At what point are you giving people an offer that they can't refuse? So that is what you have to bear in mind. Is it a token of appreciation? Is it, you know, is it something that really coerces people into participating in your study? And so really good question, and it's really important to consider that. You don't want an enticement to participate in the study that causes people to do something that they wouldn't volunteer to do otherwise.
Thank you.
Yeah. Autonomy and inclusion. So potential participants in our studies, they should have the right to refuse participation, full voluntary participation in our studies, but they should also have the right to participate. And so I like to use my own research here to illustrate this. So when we think about autonomy and inclusion, we often think about the right to refuse, and people have the right to refuse to participate. But in certain situations, when you're working, so for example, me working with people in homeless situations, I have to go through gatekeepers, case managers or key workers, to be able to invite their participants, their clients, to participate in my research. And often they feel quite protective of their clients. And sometimes I get a real notion that they are quite protective of their clients and make judgments about whether it would be okay for them to participate or not. When they're fully grown adults who have not been declared incompetent by a judge or a court. And so that right to participate and give and tell their experiences and be represented in research gets taken away from them through this kind of paternalistic care ethos. Another way in which the right to participate gets stripped away from people is historically in biomedical research, women would be excluded from certain areas of research, certain areas or certain topics. For example, there's evidence that the exclusion of women from research on cardiac arrests and heart attacks meant that there was not a complete understanding of the different pattern of symptoms that women exhibited. I'm conscious that I'm talking to a bunch of health professionals here, but the research showed that professionals in the ER were slower to recognize heart attacks in women, and that the mortality rates among women were higher because of gender bias in research. And so so right to participate is a broad category of different situations in which people can be systematically excluded and justified by gatekeepers or by researchers who think, for example, that women's different hormones are going to mess up their research results. So right to participate and right to refuse must be addressed and considered as you develop your research design, as you decide who's going to be included in your research and what your eligibility criteria are going to be. Okay, data protection and confidentiality. What is confidentiality and why is it important? And what are the differences between confidentiality, anonymity, and pseudonymity? So it's 10 after 10. So I'm gonna speed it up here for a second and say anonymity means that no one can trace your participation back to you, that your identity is not known in a data set. Confidentiality means I'm going to hold your participation confidential. I'm not going to link your name to your responses in any kind of report of our findings. I'm going to anonymize our transcripts, but I will still know that you participated, right? So if a transcript, for example, or a data set is anonymized, but I collected those data from a person who signed a consent form with me, I know who they are, so it's confidential. It's not necessarily anonymous. Pseudonymous refers to things like, for example, a data set in which you have a person's demographic characteristics and you have a line of data in a data set where that unique combination, you don't have to have my name, you don't have to remember my birthday, or anything like that. Well, you might have my birthday, you know what year I was born, you know how old I am, you know what my gender is, you know what my nationality is, you know what my ethnicity is. If you have a data set from the psychology department at UL and you have that line of data, you know who I am. You can pick me out of that line of data. So even though you don't have my name in there, those data are pseudonymous, not anonymous. As long as you have a key that links different waves of data to a particular person. So if I have a key that says Ronni is participant number 101, and my data set has 101 for my identifier, those data are not anonymous as long as that key exists. So these are some of the differences between confidentiality, anonymity, and pseudonymity, which are really important for us to bear in mind. Because GDPR is concerned with personal data. So we all have to protect participants' personal data and maintain their confidentiality. And we would do that whether GDPR existed or not. But now we have to do it in ways that conform to GDPR, that particular data protection regulation. And in the GDPR definition, personal data is any information relating to an identifiable person who can be directly or indirectly identified by reference to an identifier, like I just described. So, what are some types of personal data? Some types of personal data are people's demographic information. It's their occupation. It's also their responses to your questionnaire and to your interview questions. Strategies that we use to protect personal data in UL are we anonymize transcripts to the fullest extent possible. We never link people's identities to their responses. We store our data in GDPR protected OneDrive, and we only share participants' data with members of the research team that are mentioned or that are listed on the ethics proposal. Do personal data have to be anonymous for your project to be approved? And the answer to this is no. But the reason that I put this here is because often in an ethics proposal, I see researchers refer to data that are not going to be anonymous as anonymous or anonymized. And I worry sometimes that they think they have to use that language in order to get it approved, and that is not true. You often will do research with people who are known to you and known to each other. So those data must be held. Then we refer to our procedures there as maintaining participants' confidentiality. Right to be forgotten refers to a participant's right to have their data removed from your data set. And that can be more or less complicated. So once you've anonymized transcripts, once you've anonymized your data set, it's no longer possible to remove their data. But as long as there's an identifier, your participant has the right to have their data removed and deleted from your data set. So there are 6 GDPR principles. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but these are lawfulness, fairness and transparency, integrity and confidentiality, storage limitations, purpose limitations, data minimization, and data accuracy. So everybody in UL would have gone through a GDPR training. And so I've put this in the wrong place. So no, that's research integrity. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So all of us are expected to be familiar with these. I won't go over them now, but I just want to refresh you on what those 6 principles are that we are supposed to adhere to be compliant with GDPR. Later on, I think Derval Hallett is going to give a talk in the HRI sometime this semester maybe, or soon, and she will probably go into this into detail. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about research integrity. It's different from research ethics. The key elements of research integrity are honesty, rigor, transparency and open communication, care and respect of all participants, and accountability. And here's a little graphic that just explains all of them. So we have honesty in all aspects of our research. We have rigor, in line with prevailing disciplinary norms and standards, and performing research using appropriate methods, adhering to an agreed protocol where appropriate. Transparency and open communication, declaring potential and competing interests, reporting of research data collection methods, analysis and interpretation, making findings widely available, etc. Care and respect for all participants in research, and accountability. We should cultivate a research environment in which individuals and organizations own the research process and ensure individuals and organizations are held to account when their behavior falls short of our ethical principles. So that's the key principles of research integrity. The research integrity officer is Natalia. I don't know her last name, but she will be given an HRI talk later on this semester, and I would encourage everybody to go to that one as well. In UL, research integrity refers to the performance of research to the highest standards of professionalism and rigor, and to the accuracy and integrity of the research record in publications and elsewhere. University of Limerick is committed to ensuring that all research carried out under its auspices meet the highest standards of integrity, and that an environment of research integrity prevails through the promotion of good research practice, together with the use of fair, effective, and transparent procedures to address research misconduct. So I lifted that from our policies and procedures to make sure that everybody is aware of UL's stance on research integrity. Fraud in research is a violation of research integrity. And so I wanted to ask you all what you understood as what constitutes fraud in research. Fraud in research can happen at the data collection stage. It can happen at the data interpretation stage and the dissemination stage. And it's not true that only bad people commit fraud. People can commit fraud unintentionally, or they can commit fraud under feelings of immense pressure. And so to produce research that gets published so that they can, get promoted in their careers. There's widespread examples of fraud in research. In recent years, one of the most egregious examples again came from social psychology, in which a Dutch researcher called Diederik Stoppel was found to have completely fabricated the data at the basis of his on the basis of his publications. So it is something that happens, and it's sometimes hard to detect. So the research ethics priorities and processes for us in UL, I just want to go over those quickly. When do you need to obtain ethics approval? If you're doing research with human participants, you need ethics approval. There are other kind of gray areas we could go into if you wanted to around the use of data extracted from public social media. For example, there are some gray areas there. When is ethics approval not required? Are you not doing research with human participants? Maybe you don't need ethics approval, but are you using participants' data that was obtained from them in their health records? Then you may need ethical approval. I've had some instances lately where I've been told an account where a student told me that their advisor told them they didn't need ethical approval because their research wasn't going to be, their final year project research wasn't going to be published. That's not true. So if you're supervising a student's final year project or master's research project, major research project or master's thesis, they need ethics approval. And we need to make sure that all of our colleagues are aware of that. So these are ethical considerations that we look at about when we review your ethics proposal. We are looking for respect for persons, how you manage privacy, confidentiality, anonymity, and pseudonymity. We look at your research design quality and the rigor of your research design. We look at the extent to which you have designed your study so participants give voluntary and informed consent, how you're managing and minimizing risks to participants, and how you've approached your selection and inclusion of participants in your research. So you're not violating participants' right to refuse or right to be included. The full review process in EHS Rec happens from September to June. So we have a monthly submission date for the full review process. It's reviewed, it's submitted, it's allocated to reviewers, it's reviewed, a decision is taken, feedback is given, Most of the time, minor revisions are needed, and that's re-reviewed. And usually at that point, the decision is an approval. So this just gives you, so it can be approved, your application can be approved with no further actions, can be a minor revisions amendment. So you just respond to those and we review them and usually approve it. A major revision or amendment would be given in a situation where there are significant concerns about the content of the application and or its quality, to the extent that we can't feel confident that we would ultimately be able to approve that application. Under my chairship of the ethics committee, that happened very rarely. Something that is not approved is usually not approved by us because of jurisdiction issues. It should have gone to the HSE or TUSLA or ICGP. Very rarely because of the content or the topic. Expedited review, we review year round. It's for low risk studies. There is no, we never call a study no risk. So low risk studies in terms of topic, procedures, and participant groups. And the materials that you use are the expedited form, and you submit all your study materials, and it would go through a similar review process, but an expedited version of that. Research with HSE employees in HSE places with HSE patients or patients' data. These kinds of projects need to get ethical approval through the HSE rec system. Keys to a successful proposal are clarity, completeness, and consistency, the 3 C's. When we review your application, we're looking at all of the ethical aspects of your design and the overall quality of your application, specifically how and who you recruit, what you ask your participants to do, the extent to which you are gaining voluntary and informed consent through an accurate study description, your management of dual relationships, and your protection of personal data. Do's and don'ts for a good ethics proposal. Please answer the question that's asked of you in each of the boxes and be concise, clear, consistent, and detailed, and proofread your application, please. Do not use jargon, or if you do, explain it. Don't leave any blank response boxes. Don't have any missing signatures. Don't have any unexplained concepts or procedures, and or an incomplete appendix of study materials. If you do all that, you're probably in pretty good shape. And that's it. I'm done. So I went a little bit over, but let me see if you've got any kind of questions in the chat, and let's see what we can talk about for the next few minutes.
Thanks,